Hello and welcome to part 5 of the Affliction series from the lupusproject.org. Here at the lupusproject.org, we strive to simplify the lessons of affliction in order to enhance your New Testament practice. In this part 5, we're going to diagram a typical faith walk that progresses from a God equals maybe mindset to a God equals fact mindset, and what that means in regards to end time prophecy. I believe this is a critical lesson in a time when states are attempting to weaponize the medical industrial complex as well as the judiciary to behave in maniacally hostile ways to the kinds of discussions commonly held at the lupusproject.org. It's difficult to understate how important it is for me to highlight the fact that developing the ability to thrive in the face of long-term affliction is learned behavior. It would be massively irresponsible of me to claim that this kind of learning is exclusive to certain people or only made possible thanks to a certain genetic makeup. In reality, developing these abilities is a natural result of an uncompromising spiritual pursuit that anyone is capable of achieving. In a narrow path practice, the adoption of simple frameworks that is then applied in an uncompromising manner will facilitate the ability to endure long-term affliction as well as remain calm in the face of highly emotional now-time events. Both of these skills are needed to further the narrow path practice to its logical conclusion, which is full-time immersion in the Holy Spirit. Employing that framework to facilitate a process of slowly dying into the Holy Spirit can be nearly effortless. While the practice itself is rather easy to execute, dealing with the aftermath of the experience in our present-day environment can present a severe threat to an experiencer's freedom, health, and welfare. This is especially true when extraterrestrial life forms begin to manifest as a result of the practice. Today, lack of manifestations isn't a dispensation thing or a mistranslation thing. The lack of miracles is a choice thing. Let's see why as we look at a typical faith walk. We'll begin in Hebrews 2:14 and 15, where Paul reminds us that Christ's incarnation and resurrection did destroy the power of the devil to hold people in bondage through their fear of death. The word might, in my opinion, is there to emphasize that in each person's life a choice must be made to accept or reject that release from bondage. Let's put that fear of death on a vertical axis. The goal of this faith walk will be to confront, then ultimately bypass, that toxic emotion that none of us should suffer from. Prior to an encounter with the Holy Spirit, a practitioner is fully aware of Dimension 1 on the left, which is their present-day reality in the world readily apparent to all of us humans. The practitioner has been told there's some Dimension 2 they can access, but since they haven't done that yet, they may not completely believe it yet. Here, the practitioner is going to put faith into action and keep asking, seeking, and knocking until that fear of death is no longer gripping them and they're convinced that there actually is a Dimension 2. Releasing that fear of death will allow the Holy Spirit to come in and get to work. Remember, Christian practice is an intensely interactive practice that won't work for you if it's just kept on a shelf. To me, it's a 24/7 immersion that leads to ever-increasing levels of spiritual and emotional freedom. When a person's faith walk passes that line, suddenly everything changes. Dimension 2 gets confirmed. Manifestations happen. Dimension 1 is undeniably a dead in sin dimension, while this Dimension 2 is a dead to sin dimension. Acts 5 applies, wherein the use of deception in Dimension 2 really does cause instantaneous death. Suddenly, this Dimension 2 is no joke. At this point, the word faith takes on an entirely new meaning. Upon confirming Dimension 2, the word faith is no longer a maybe word, it has everything to do with process words. Practitioner is no longer burdened by a bunch of maybes and contradictions. Now the practitioner realizes the purpose of their life is to help bring the will of God into this Dimension 1, the dead in sin dimension. To do this, determination is no longer sufficient. In order to represent the will of God into a world that has rejected it, a practitioner must be resolute and unwavering. The incorporation of resoluteness into the practitioner's faith walk is a point where the narrow path practice really begins. Getting to the heart of a narrow path practice, what we're striving for as a goal is emerging with the Holy Spirit. This process is identical to the previous faith walk, with the exception that the practitioner is striving for single-minded resoluteness. The practitioner realizes it's nearly impossible to speak and act according to the will of God within the dead and sin dimension without the existential presence of God. Trouble is, in our age, it's nearly impossible to interject the existential presence of God without causing a mass casualty event. Reference Acts 5 for what I'm talking about there. Practitioners need to clear space emotionally and physically in order to receive the existential presence of God. To do that, practitioners must employ unwavering dedication to a practice that may take years and will not be without challenge. Getting into the fundamentals of spiritual warfare, here we see how a resolute practitioner will be challenged when targeting a full immersion in the uncompromising Holy Spirit. Coercive forces are deliberately aligned to obstruct a person's faith walk, or ghost dance if you prefer to call it that, which simultaneously prevents the will of God from bringing the healing into the places that need it the most. Using coercion to divert people off their faith walk while simultaneously obstructing the will of God is a fundamental tactic of existential evil. It always has been. It is done because the goal of evil really is to convince you to go along with its plan to destroy your soul. That Americans have stood silent as this coercive dynamic is amplified, codified, and given preferential legal status gets to the root cause of America's social chaos, our integrity crisis, and our so-called mental health crisis. Confronting the deadly compromise means resolute, narrow path practitioners no longer accept the imposition of blasphemous frameworks in their life, nor will the practitioner cooperate with blasphemous frameworks. Go along to get along becomes completely irrelevant to a resolute practitioner. It is irrational to expect a person living a life dead to sin to cooperate with rituals, rules, or speech restrictions designed and supported by existential evil. Today, we have a very serious problem, and this state is actively involved in amplifying this deadly compromise, primarily via a weaponized medical industrial complex and secondarily via massive amounts of domestic propaganda. That state and federal governments are jointly funding this kind of toxicity and bigotry should not surprise anyone. These actions are reflective of the collective cowardice that comes from an absence of moral backbone in a society that at large that has allowed this to happen. Any resolute practitioner can take this faith walk. It's not limited to chosen people or special people because everyone already is chosen and special. Nobody that I'm aware of has yet completely cut themselves off from their ability to embrace radical reconciliation, but many, I believe, are very close to it. If one single practitioner out of the billions it claims to be makes it into the no cooperation zone with enough resoluteness to then turn around and bring the will of God back into this lost and dying world, then that person is one who has really dedicated their life to doing the will of God. We should really be preparing for, which is the time when the existential presence of God becomes manifest again. This is when we'll see healings happen and what seems impossible suddenly becomes practical. It's also the point where the intellectual arguments that create the coercive resistance will suddenly collapse. This is not a question of if, this is simply a question of when, and I believe that time is extremely close to where we are right now. Event that has yet to come about. This event will confirm this faith process and defend the existential presence of God wherever he chooses for that to manifest first. As Daniel 12 states, and at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation, even to that same time. What are we talking about here? Michael represents the war angels. That point, all of this coercive resistance that's been built up to try and distract people from their faith walk and obstruct the will of God is going to collapse. It will collapse and it will be attacked in a manner that we have not seen in our lifetimes.